All right. So we are doing SNL questions for FTCM, and this is the third video. Okay. It's gonna be about 25 minutes. Let's get started. Uh, just move my stuff around a little. Okay. Fourth term is you student. She's under stress, so um, her cortisol is more than normal in her blood. What is a precursor to cortisol? Now, if you remember, I'm gonna start from like a basic topic, just types of signals between cells, right? Two broad categories, and that's determined by where the receptor for the hormone is. Either they have intracellular receptor or extracellular. Okay. Now, intracellular is most of the time is steroid hormones. Uh, and this is things like cortisol, aldosterone, sex hormones, and vitamin D. Yeah, vitamin D. Vitamin D is a hormone, okay? It is also a vitamin, but it acts as a hormone. And I'm going to explain why probably in the future in this video. What else? You know, sex hormone is like a bunch of stuff. There's a bunch of stuff that are like aldosterone. Oh, yeah, and cortisol. There's a bunch of stuff. Uh, so each one of them is like a category. But so all these are steroids, and they're all of them. They come from cholesterol, right? Now, the ones with so if this is a cell, and these guys are what? These are fat based, right? So if this is an intercellular one, I'm gonna here represent it with the color blue. It will come. The receptor is somewhere inside, right? And it will come here. It will induce direct. So let me write this down. Um, so it goes directly to the nucleus. So here, point here is that it gene expression. So they're all from cortisol and they're all steroids except for one important exception, and that's T4 and T3. And these are thyroid hormones, right? These guys also change gene expression, just like I showed you. They go directly into the nucleus and they're basically they act as transcription factors once in the nucleus. What is a transcription factor? Is a molecule that binds the DNA in a certain way that induces transcription of that piece of DNA around it, and that causes something to be expressed, some protein to be produced, or some protein to uh, stop, down regulates or up regulates certain genes. Right? That's basically what it boils down to. So these group. Now extracellular ones, there is many of them. Let's see if these. So for these guys, the receptor, if this is a cell and this is a nucleus, the receptor is a protein here, right? And when like our hormone binds here, this protein then does something to another protein and it does something to another protein. It makes a cascade that can do a lot of things to the cell. Some examples I'm going to give here, right, are the G proteins. Now, the G proteins can be a GS, can be a GI, can be a GQ, right? Each one of them do a different thing. GS, what it does is that it increases CAMP, right? GI, sorry, increases CAMP. It decreases CAMP. The final result of GQ, right? So is well, it first increases IP3 and DAG, right? And then this happens through phospholipase C, right? So phospholipase C. And then this uh, activates what? This activates protein kinase C. So, right, remember C? Uh, so the way I remember it, and then CAMP increases protein kinase A, right? So the way I remember it, protein kinase A is actually stands for this adenosine, right? Protein kinase C is like phospholipase C, and so the IP3 also leads to calcium release. So now you can think of, I'll give you an example, right? Smooth muscles that look like this, right? One thing that leads to their constriction is having intercellular calcium, right? Through a pathway you may or have not heard about it. Now, this increased calcium, so you can tell anywhere we have smooth muscles, if we activate the receptors, then these muscles are going to contract. And that's literally what we have, right? What's an example of this? Okay, for example, the alpha receptors, the alpha 1 receptors on your vessels, they're a GQ. When you activate them, they increase IP3, they increase DAG. That what that results in is that calcium release that causes vasoconstriction, right? Vasoconstriction. So, what's another example? Your eyes, right? The way they open and close. Again, that's anytime you have smooth muscle. It's usually contracted by extra calcium through a GQ receptor somewhere, right? Now let's look at some of the examples they give us, see what they fall into, right? So sphingomyelin, what does sphingomyelin produce? I can't think of it producing anything. Does it produce prostaglandins? Maybe. Maybe it's a precursor to prostaglandins, right? Not exactly sure what the precursor was there. Aldosterone, steroid, right? Vitamin D, we don't say it's a steroid, but it comes from cholesterol, right? Uh, and it like through sun and a bunch of other stuff, it can change to vitamin D, right? Um, but the precursor is cortisol, right? Uh, omega 6 fatty acids. I can't think of like anything that this thing produces that's a hormone. All right, spent 7 minutes on here, but explained a good concept that I'm going to come back to. You can't imagine how many questions I've seen that basically is describing like a hormone that goes into the cell, and the answer is this guy. That's a horrible color for highlight. The answer is this guy. Why? Because the other thing is all these guys are usually fatty, right? But these ones, the ligands, the things that induce the reactions, these are usually protein, right? So there's a lot of questions about this thing. They either ask you, "Oh, what is it made of?" And you got to be like, "Oh, it's like kind of like a peptide, right? Peptide type of thing." Or they'll be like, "What does it do?" It goes into the nucleus, right? So because it's a protein that goes into the nucleus, it's an exception, and exceptions are highly tested. Okay. I've at least like even in the SU exams, I've seen 10 questions like that, right? But it's not even about SU in general. A theme in medicine, when something is an exception, people are likely to make a mistake about it, right? So it's important to weed those people out. It's important to show them they're wrong before they get on to the patient, right? So if it's an exception, if it's hard to remember, then you got to remember it. Or if it has particularly bad outcome for a patient, right? Use term one yet stuff like that isn't really necessary, but if something like that comes up, I'll make sure to mention it. Just for example, right? There's this disease called Wolf Parkinson White. It's an arrhythmia, right? You're not supposed to give him a certain types of antiarrhythmics, right? So you can't give him beta blockers. You can't give him anything that makes the heart slower. So this specific type of arrhythmia is like everything else that you give a patient who has arrhythmia doesn't work on this and makes it much worse, right? So this is highly tested. So what do we give to a patient with Wolf Parkinson White? What like why can't we give them beta blockers? Why can't we give them calcium channels? Why do we have to give them prokinamide? And what happens if you do it? And so you can imagine then questions about diagnosing someone with Wolf Parkinson White is also really important because you have to like know what to look for to diagnose them, right? And the answer is, so if this is like a normal, uh, like EKG that looks really beautiful, what you need to look for is this. delta wave, that the wave instead of looking like this, it's kind of like, so instead of going up straight, it kind of like does this, right? So it looks like, so this part, instead of having that, it has like this extra, this part is extra, right? This is way out of the field for you, but I'm just trying to like demonstrate a concept that keeps coming back in medicine, or not in medical education, not necessarily medicine. Of course, in medicine too. If you're more likely to make a mistake on something, you better practice that more. 40-year-old overweight man um, asked about diabetes. Uh, so he asked, why does he need to take insulin, right? Uh, why does when he doesn't take insulin, his blood sugar goes up? Why? Okay. So the way this works, first of all, what does insulin do? All insulin does is through GLUT4. GLUT4. Important, super important to know, right? Now, two types of cells have expressed GLUT4, muscle plus fat, right? Let's draw this muscle cell that's like like this. It keeps going from this way and this way. It has nuclei all around it, right? So this muscle cell has these vesicles near the surface, right? If you zoom in on those vesicles, right? Let's look at them here. Uh, this is the muscle surface, right? This is the, like, let's say one of the nuclei is here, the other nuclei is here, right? And this is like we zoomed in. This vesicle looks like this, has the protein GLUT4 on it, right? This is GLUT4. Let's label it so we don't get confused. What insulin does is that it facilitates joining of this vesicle to the surface. So what it ends up looking like is something like this. After it joins, is like you got your muscle, and now you got GLUT4s here because the vesicle joined, right? So now the glucose is able to come in. Okay, same theme uh, with fat cells, right? So knowing that, let's look at our answers. No insulin decrease SGLT1. SGLT1 is used in the nephron, and so the S stands for sodium glucose whatever transporter. So this is different than our glutes, right? This is for moving sodium across epithelium. It's used in our nephrons to reabsorb sodium. So you reabsorb sodium and glucose together. It uses sodium to shunt glucose in, and it's used in your gut, in your GI system, right? Um One thing to know about this that makes important is that if someone has uh, cholera, right, instead of giving them only sodium, you give them glucose and sodium. Why? Because if you have cholera, you're using a lot of sodium. That's the main problem, right? You're using a lot of fluid and sodium. Actually, water follows sodium too. So if you're able to give someone sodium and water, and you're able to get the sodium inside, then the water comes inside too. So the way we do it, it also is that we also give them glucose, and that glucose and sodium, the glucose kind of helps the sodium get across, right? So again, talking about SGLT1, this is kind of what we're looking for. GLUT5, I think, is for fructose. GLUT2 is for metabolic stuff. So you see it in the liver, you see it in the intestine. It's like for moving sugar out of the intestine into the liver to get stored, to get processed, right? For metabolic stuff. That's the way I remember it. So it's this, right? No uptake into fat and muscle, high blood sugar. Beautiful. Uh, ooh, I just remembered I don't have the answer key for these. So if I'm not sure about something, I would have to skip it. The rate of diffusion of a substance across a cell membrane will increase if, right? Concentration gradient across the membrane decreases. No. So here, rate of diffusion. Say if rate of diffusion we want it to go up, what needs to go up? Let's write them down here. So concentration goes up, the gradient, right? Gradient. Okay. Um, what? So we want the molecule to be smaller. We want the If it's a bilayer, we want it to be more fat soluble. So you know how to read these, right? For more diffusion, we want more concentration. For more diffusion, we want a smaller molecule. For more diffusion, we want a more fat soluble molecule. Okay. Molecular weight increases. No, that goes against it. Surface area of the membrane decreases. Oh, and so more diffusion, obviously more surface, right? Right. Um, so let's say if like surface is this big and the molecules are trying to diffuse, if it's this big, then three times as much can get diffused, right? Um, no, the surface decreases the moisture. The thickness of the membrane increases. That makes sense that if it's thicker, you'll have less stuff going through, right? And then the last one is the lipid solubility. Um, and it does mention a cell membrane. So the reason for that is a cell membrane has like these lipids, right? These phospholipids keep going like this. So if I were to magically like install a mod that shows me how lipophilic things are, it would probably highlight this middle area for me, right? Um, and so when like a molecule wants to get across, it has to go through this gap, right? So if it's more lipophilic, it's likely to have an easier time to go through it. Oh gosh, one of these questions with all of these fancy stuff, but they're really important. They're important in understanding your uh, improving your understanding of action potentials and cell potentials. So um, the membrane peaks at 50 millivolts, right? Driving force. I don't even know what that means. But okay. So when it's the concept, I'm gonna explain the concept, and then I'm gonna say what I think what means by driving force. The concept is wherever this thing is, wherever the cell sits, if it's closer to, so the cell potential will be closest to the ion that has the highest permeability, right? Okay, so here we have this, we have like all different concentrations, sodium chloride, like calcium, potassium here, and also we have them also here, right? They're both sides. Here, calcium chloride, sodium, potassium, right? So, but like let's say the hole for calcium is this big, the hole for chloride is barely any big, right? Hole for sodium is like medium, the hole for calcium, potassium is large. So, and let's these potentials is basically what the meaning behind these numbers is that listen to this super carefully. If we completely open up permeability to this ion, so let's say potassium, if we completely open up the permeability to this potassium, the membrane potential would rest at this, right? So this means if potassium gets completely open, right? So potassium can go over all day, like nothing is stopping potassium to go around, but everything else is still restricted with their channels. Then cell's potential will be at negative 80. Okay, that's what it means. Okay, so that does make sense then. If the cell potential is positive 50, okay, then potassium and chloride that have negative voltages, these guys are having a small, they're not having an easiest time to go across the cell membrane. In this case, when we have positive 50 compared to these two other guys, right? So in fact, in an action potential, you got like something like this, right? Um, Forgotten exactly how an action potential looks. It's been a while ago, but I know the theory still. That's kind of where you want to end up, like in term five, term four, kind of like understanding all the theory, but forgetting some of the details. But when an action potential looks like this is like negative 60, this is positive 50. Cell usually has high permeability to potassium. That's why it's negative 60. That's why it's close to potassium, right? It's probably actually not negative 60, it's negative like 70, right? And even in repolarization when it goes lower, you have more than average, so this is negative 80, you have more than average activation of your potassium channels. So let's say our cell potassium potential is like this. If sodium channels all of a sudden start opening up, we go closer to what sodium wants it to be. Sodium wants it to be negative 60. So it goes up fast. And then sodium channels get deactivated, so sodium permeability goes down. Potassium channel gets activated, so you have it go down and even lower, right? That's basically what happens behind a action potential. Now, the greatest driving force, I'm assuming it has like the greatest potential to move our action potential, right? That's what I'm assuming. So we're up here. It's asking what has the greatest potential to move it down here. Obviously, it should be something that is has the lowest potential, right? And for that reason, I'm choosing potassium. But what if it said like what ion has the input has like the highest probability of having the highest permeability? Then the answer would have been sodium, right? Interestingly, because we have four ions, we can't tell exactly what do we can we tell it's sodium or it's a lot of calcium and a little bit of potassium that kind of like cancel each other out to like lead to something like 50. No, we can't tell, right? So basically the way it works is that we average all these out, considering their permeability. So let's say if we are able to rate permeability on a 1 to 10 system, right, then it would be like, okay, and let's say this thing's permeability was 5, this was 3. I'm just giving random numbers just to teach you, and this thing's was 2. If these are the permeabilities, then we would go, okay, what is permeability of, this was potassium, right? Negative 80 times 2 plus permeability of calcium chloride, negative 40, negative 40 times 4 plus, right? We just multiply the 80 times 5. We'll multiply the permeabilities uh, with the, so what was, yeah, 60 times 4, right? And we divide this over 2 plus 4 plus 3 plus 5. So we would do a weighted average with respect to permeability, right? And we would get the final potential. This would give us a final potential. Obviously, the permeability is not on a scale of 1 to 10, but I'm just trying to demonstrate a concept that that's how it works. That's what gives us the membrane potential, right? The ratios of permeabilities timed the ions divided by summation of the ratios of permeabilities. If you don't understand that, um, try watching this part again and again. And then if you still don't understand it, come back to it a week from now. Yeah. Which of the following is true? Part of me keeps thinking I've done these questions before. But if I didn't, I would highlight them here. So in DNA, A binds to T and C binds to G, right? And we're talking about DNA. DNA doesn't have any use, right? So I don't know what that means. So yes, yes, yes. So these are not your answer. Yes, this is not your answer. Yes, these weren't your answer from that side, right? So your answer is A or C. C with C and D, yeah, you don't necessarily need them to. It's not impossible to have them the same, but you don't need them to be the same. Now, sorry, what are you? So they all are possible. This is like improbable and probably wrong, right? Oh, it's gonna be making about this thing. Yeah, I've definitely done this before. Hopefully, I haven't made a video about it. I just like went over it to make sure I know. Overall charge of DNA is um, DNA is usually negative, right? So that doesn't help us. I'm gonna go with 12. Look this part up, right? I don't know. It's unimportant, but I would go with 12. I mean, it's probably important in SU in this SU exam, but not super important in the future. I wouldn't think it's important, even if it's on the exam everywhere. I still don't think it's important. It just shows the examiner doesn't understand the USMLE if that's heavily tested. Uh, Forfeiting, seizures, hearing loss, vision loss. So this 3-year old has a lot of problems. I think I know what it has. Facial abnormalities. Okay, Zellweger syndrome. That's a paroxysm problem, right? It's a paroxysm, and these kids die really soon, right? And there's nothing you can do. But you got to understand for answering this question, what do paroxysms do? Do they uh, synthesis proteins? No, ribosomes do that, right? The ATP produce? No, mitochondria does that. Intracellular vesicular transport. Maybe this is talking about Golgi. Maybe talking about ER. I don't know. None of those things are. Lipid synthesis. This happens between mitochondria and the cytoplasm, right? The answer is this: metabolism of very long chain fatty acids. Okay, and there is also a disease that they can't. Thing is called metachromatic leukodystrophy, something like that. They can't specifically. They can't do the very long chain fatty acids. There's also one that they can do branch chain fatty acids, and that one is called. I don't know what it's called, but that's also it's also a disease. Look it up. It's not important for now, actually. So if you watched my video about teaching like how to study as a first year medical student, then I have a mock lecture on Prader-Willi syndrome, and I show you how to uh, study, like how to like use Anki to take notes and stuff like that. So take a look at that. Go onto the channel on their playlists, and like there's one how to study something like that, and take a look at that. Familiarize yourself with Anki. Learn how to make flashcards. It's gonna be a necessarily, even if you don't need it to pass or to do well, it's gonna be something you can get practice with, and then when term 4 starts, you can hit the ground running, right? Uh, so it's basically asking about Willy Porter. So you gotta know the gene is the SNP one, not Uber one. So I know this has Uber. This is SNP. This is just how I remember it. I don't know why it works. Sorry. The Uber one uh, is for the Angelman syndrome, the one that moms are supposed to express. So probably your dad, the gene responsible for that is usually inherited from your dad's side, right? And so basically, it's just well, more likely, right? Likely wise, it's inability to produce SNRP, right? Likely. Now, this can be from a mutation. It can be, but not maternal, right? It has to be paternal mutation or paternal imprinting. It's important to understand, and I don't know what the answer key to this question says. It's important to understand that the mutation is more common than the imprinting, but the imprinting is more of an interesting clinical case. That's why there's more emphasis put on it. But in this case, I would go with B because parental imprinting does happen, and that's why you studied this because it's an interesting case or whatever. But still, the mutation of losing SNRP, this SNRPN or whatever, this is more common than having it imprinted. Okay, but the imprinting does happen, and if it's the dad supposed to express it and the dad doesn't express it, then that's a problem. Okay, got time for one more question at most. I'm gonna try to attempt 23, but it might get cut off. Watch part 4 for that. Uh, hmm. Okay, so it's log of RTZF, which is -60, and then I don't know this. I'm just writing this. So it's out in, and then here is either positive or negative, right? But I know potassium is by default needs to be -60. Like I just know that potassium is -60. Let's do in over. Let's do out over in. So that would be 12 over 120. That would be 1 over 10, right? It would give us a negative here, and then with uh, negative here, right? So that will give us a -60. So if you're supposed to keep it as out over in, we don't need the negative sign. Now let's plug everything in. I really hope you understood that. I'm really good at math. I hope, like, I can't go any slower for this, but let's go intercellular 140